This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 4 of Here's How. In this podcast, Sinn Féin and the Sunday Independent, the government rising in the opinion polls, could they be re-elected next year, and changes to the laws on prostitution in Ireland.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Ireland is one of the most open economies in the world. I don't know how many times I've heard that blathered out by gombeen politicians. They probably don't have a clue, but that phrase does actually mean something. The openness of an economy is a technical measure. It can be precisely calculated and compared from one country to another. It's not even that hard to calculate. It's the total trade, imports plus exports, of a country, divided by the GDP, the size of the economy of that country. And it turns out that those gombeens are right. The only countries in the world that are higher up than Ireland on the index of open economies are Hong Kong, Luxembourg and Singapore. I'm putting links for all these sources on the webpage of this podcast, by the way. It's not surprising that those are all small countries. Of course, small countries are bound to have a lot of trade for the size of their economies. And it's not surprising that they're all rich countries. We're richer because we sell more, and because we're richer, we buy more. We take it as completely normal that a large majority of the products that we buy are imported, and we take it as normal that so many of us work in industries that sell mostly abroad. And we take it as normal that we take it as normal. But you only have to go as far as the continent to find a different attitude. We have no problem, for example, drinking foreign beers from Germany or America or England, and we sell loads of our own beer to them. Wines from Chile and South Africa are commonplace here, but if you go to France, they're almost unheard of. They will only drink French wine. And the whole EU single market project was almost collapsed because of Germany refusing to allow non-German beers onto their market. That holds true for many products in many countries, but not in Ireland. So what, you might think? We buy more, we sell more. Because we're a small country, we can't make all the products we need for an advanced economy, so we specialize in some, like food, software, pharmaceuticals, and we buy the rest using the export earnings from those industries that we specialize in. And mostly that doesn't matter. But there is one area in which it has a big effect. It makes our economy different to Germany or France or the United States. And we have to take that into account when we're setting economic policy. The effect is on stimulus spending. Later in the podcast, I'll be talking to independent MEP Luke Ming Flanagan and Sinn Féin Dáil candidate for Dublin Midwest Eoin Ó Broin. And in their own ways, both of them are promoting the idea of stimulus spending. Luke Ming Flanagan with farm subsidies, Eoin Ó Broin with government spending in general. Both of them are smart guys. I have a lot of respect for both of them, but I think they're both wrong on this. The basic idea is that the government can take taxpayers' money and give it to farmers in one case or to public sector workers. Maybe it's a coincidence that in both cases it's benefiting their constituents. But they both argue that the people paying for that, the taxpayers, shouldn't worry because it's benefiting them too. And that's not a bad argument. It's true, at least to a degree. Farmers who get farm subsidies go into towns and buy goods and services from people who are not farmers. And that benefits those traders directly, and the same goes for public sector workers, and that money is spent on again and again and stimulates economic growth and everybody wins. That's the theory anyway, but there are two problems with it. The first is that the government isn't always as good at spending money as the taxpayers who earned that money in the first place. People are just more careful when they're spending their own money. That means that the economic growth generated by that spending is less than it might have been if it was spent by the taxpayers themselves, who have a greater incentive to avoid waste. This issue is hotly debated in the US, with economists on the left and the right arguing whether or not the economic benefit of the spending is more or less than enough to offset the impact of the taxation. You can never really settle that argument because there are so many confounding factors and it's impossible to agree how to allow for them. But in Ireland we have another problem as well. In our economy, more than almost any other economy in the world, when that economics stimulus money is spent, a very high percentage of it goes straight out of the country because so much of what we buy is imported. In our regular economy, that very high level of imports is offset by an even higher level of exports, so it's not a problem. But when you're dealing with stimulus spending, when it is the government taxing people in order to spend and encourage economic growth, then 100% of that money must come from taxes on Irish people. And more than almost any other country in the world, only a very small portion of the benefit of that spending actually stays in the country.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
I'm joined now on the line by Pat Leahy of the Sunday Business Post. Pat, before Christmas, anybody looking at the polls would have thought that the government had no chance of being re-elected. Has that changed?
Well, I think what we're seeing maybe is the beginning of a change. In the last month, we've seen Fine Gael and Labour jump by 6 points between them, 3 points each. Significant jump up from at the end of last year, where Labour was on 6 or 7% and Fine Gael in the low 20s, at which level it would have been ridiculous to talk about re-election. But I think what we're seeing, and it's always important, to look at the sort of medium-term trends in polls rather than any one result, from which one might over-extrapolate. But I think it's fair to say that what we're seeing in recent polls is probably the inevitable recovery of the government parties on the back of a rising economy. Now, Fine Gael was 27% in our poll on Sunday, Labour was 10%. At that sort of level, re-election would be beyond them. But I think that what this trend means, and the fact that the engine behind it, the economic recovery that voters are feeling, seems set by all predictions to continue, is that it's now possible to see a way ahead how the government could find a path to re-election.
I think you're right.
Yet, but it's possible to see it in the future.
I think you're right. There does seem to be a way ahead there. But if you look at the last general election, Sinn Féin actually got less than 10% of the vote. There's only been one poll recently where they've got less than 20%. And if you look at the three biggest parties, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil in the polls, is it at all plausible that you could form a government and have two of those parties outside that government?
Well, I think it is, if the sort of progress that we've seen in the early months of the year for Fine Gael and Labour continues. I think Fine Gael would need to get to the early 30s, Labour to 12, 13, 14 to make government on their own, to make re-election of the current government feasible. Now, that's a pretty big ask for both parties, but I don't think it's utterly impossible at this point, and I don't think that the numbers suggest that it is completely impossible at this point. But if you had a sort of a halfway house where, Fine Gael is touching 30, Labour 11 or 12, then what you could see is them getting to within 5, maybe 10 seats of a majority, in which case some arrangement with either one of the new independent groupings or a series of individual independents might make it possible for them to form a coalition government.
And Pat, do you think, maybe looking forward to how the people will be making their decisions next year, do you think that the perception of the instability of any other arrangement will actually help the coalition?
Well, I think they'll be making a very big effort to have that as one of the dominant themes of the election. I think it is grounded in some truth. Sinn Féin passed a motion at its recent Ordesh ruling out participation in a coalition government with either one of the centre-right parties, with either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. That means that the option on that side of the ledger, if you like, is a left-led government, which would presumably comprise some arrangement involving Sinn Féin, perhaps Labour, and the left-wing independents. And I just don't think it is possible that musters the sort of parliamentary arithmetic that would make a governing majority possible. So you are left then with, I think, the most likely outcomes being either a return of the current government with or without independent or small party support, or a situation where the only feasible functioning government is one comprised of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael.
Okay, Pat Leahy from the Sunday Business Post, thank you very much for that.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
And I'm joined now by Regina Doherty, Meath TD for Fine Gael. Regina, you have a special focus on health and disability. Can you tell me about that?
I suppose it's interesting the way it happened. When I arrived here a number of years ago, one of the things that we had to do was to be assigned to two Oireachtas committees, and we were asked by our own whip to express an interest in which ones you would like to be a member of. And the list was sent out to us, and there's about 12 or 14 of them or something. And anyway, the one I picked was health and children, but the reason I picked it was for the children bit. Mm-hmm. And actually, probably most of the time we do the health bit and do not as much on children as we should. But that was the reason I picked the committee, because I never would have had an active interest. Like, if you get sick, you go to hospital, or engage with local services, you do that. But I would have never had a proactive interest in the delivery of health services. But it's a hugely interesting committee, and I've had such great experiences over the last number of years, and I've learned an enormous amount. And it's because of that, I suppose, it's piqued my interest in certain inequities in the delivery of our service, and it mostly centres around children and young adults, and mostly centres around people who either have physical disabilities or intellectual disabilities.
Give me a specific on the inequities.
Well, I'll give you a very stark one that I'm hoping is going to be resolved this week, is that children with Down syndrome on the mild spectrum in primary school do not get resources without having to prove that they have a secondary disability. Mm-hmm. That's something as simple as that. And we've been fighting that particular campaign to get equality of access to the resources for those children, the same as all of the children would get access to resources. But it's a wider issue around the cessation of the mobility grant, around the fact that young people with intellectual disabilities leaving school or leaving their special schools at 17 didn't have an automatic right to go to a placement when they turned 18, because those placements weren't available. Even though the money was being provided to provide services in communities, the services were being driven by the individual service providers as opposed to being tailored to the people's needs.
Well, one thing that I'm interested in that, and I realise that you're a backbench TD and you're going to tell me you're not a minister and that you have only limited input into that, but you are a government TD. How do you, and of course you came into the Dáil at a time when there was a great shortage of money and austerity. How do you think your government has done in making the cuts where they will hurt least?
I think they've done their best, but actually it isn't about cuts, because I think some of the initiatives that we've done in the last number of years as a team, there's lots of things that we've tried to do that are actually cost neutral. So it isn't a case of that, I need to jump up and down as a backbencher pleading for more money. It's actually just about how we spend the money. Now, to directly ask your question, or to answer your question, yes, there have been some cuts that have been particularly difficult to take in the last number of years, and probably the most obvious cut is the cut to the respite grant. I mean, I know we can talk about trying to, make sure that we look after the core values of particular payments around social welfare, particularly in our invalidity or our disability sector. But I think the respite grant cut was particularly hard felt by people.
Let me give you an example of a woman who I spoke to this morning. She's a single mother. She has 3 children. One of them, an 11-year-old, is severely autistic. He needs speech and language therapy. He's not getting it. He needs occupational therapy. He's not getting it. He needs physical therapy. He's not getting it. Now, this particular woman is well educated and is the sort of person who knows how to fight the system. Her description of her interaction with the HSE was that she was being thrown between services. She said that it was a Kafkaesque experience, and that she got basically nothing until last year when she had a mental breakdown, at which point she was given 4 hours of home help. How can you justify that?
You can't, and I won't. So let me tell you the first issue. And again, it's not a case of that if I was in charge, this is what we do, because there's a collective group of us from all parties and from none, that when you sit down with your blank piece of paper and you have your money that you're spending it, we all recognise that we would spend it in a different way. First of all, there isn't even a register for people with disability in this country. There isn't a register of children with autism. There is no recognition of the fact that if I'm divvying out the services, for argument's sake, in County Meath, how many speech and language therapists do I need for County Meath? We need to know where it is that the resources are needed. So let's start monitoring them, let's start measuring them. And if we actually came back to the fact of that the service needs to follow the patient, you need to know where the patient is, and then you can put the services in afterwards.
So essentially you're arguing for a database of people with disabilities, people with those sort of needs, a census of it.
It's a census is perfect. The database of disability sounds like I just want to put a pile of people who have, 2 noses on a list so that I know where it is. It's not about that, but it's about you can't put the resources where the people are if you don't know where the people are. And literally it is as simple as that. So that's the very first place that we would start, is to determine where the most need is, and then to look at actually where we're putting our resources for the best value and the outcomes.
I understand. And clearly resources is one issue. Management within the HSE is another issue. We've had a number of reports, particularly from regional hospitals, of very, very much substandard care. Is that a top-level management failure?
Well, actually, I don't agree with that statement. I have to tell you that in my experience, the people that I've had dealings with, both at the very highest level of the HSE and at the highest level locally in the HSE that I have, are absolutely second to none. The biggest issue that they have is that they're doing it with diminishing resources.
And I appreciate that's true at the moment. At the height of the boom, though, our health spending per capita was approaching that of Sweden. I don't think that there's enough alcohol in the world to get me drunk enough to imagine that our services were at the quality of Sweden.
No, they weren't, obviously, right? But, okay, again, like it's like how do you eat an elephant? You can only do it one bite at a time. Mm-hmm. The services, the disjointedness of them, the regional allocations previously, and obviously if you had better representatives in certain allocations, you got more of a pot. We need to go back now and genuinely look at where we're going with the delivery of services in our hospital trusts, in allocating regions that are not necessarily just beside each other. So it's not just Louth and Meath anymore. If somebody wakes up in the morning, no matter what's wrong with them, they have the centre of excellence available to them to be able to go to within that geographical spread, as opposed to trying to do absolutely everything out of Navan Hospital or out of Drogheda Hospital.
I understand. That's a more complex argument, and I hope to return to that. But just to move on to one other issue, I know that you have a background in IT. What's your experience of the level and quality of implementation of IT within the civil service?
It's appalling. But you know what? Okay, so that was then and this is now. We look at, if we take again the health service, we have probably about 20 different...
Just use your own experience.
Yeah, we have about 20 different IT services or systems within the health service alone. I think we have something like 9 different payroll services. Okay, it's so antiquated. We don't even have identification numbers for our patients. I mean, if you were to go to bed and have a great dream tonight and wake up in the morning, the patient identifiers and having all of their information in the cloud is exactly the way to go. We have issues in hospitals where doctors who are doing rounds won't take the charts unless somebody walks behind them and takes the information. It's all barmy. Everybody should be electronically inputting the data. The data should be held in the cloud so that if I happen to be in Donegal tomorrow and fall and break my leg and go to Donegal Regional Hospital, they will have all my entire history accessible to them instead of me walking in as a complete stranger and they need to ring my GP to find out if I'm allergic to anything. You know, that in this day and age is absolutely ridiculous. And when you look at the spend that government does on IT, we are so far behind the curve. But we're catching up. The legislation for patient identifiers is on the way. That in itself will promote obviously a joined-up approach from an IT perspective. And okay, it's not going to happen overnight, but at least the will and the impetus is there.
Regina, thank you very much for that. I appreciate you coming on Here's How. Hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks a million, Willem.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
We have on the line now Owen O'Brien, who is a councillor on South Dublin County Council. He's also the Sinn Féin candidate in Dublin Midwest. Owen, would you be a big fan of the Sunday Independent?
I haven't bought a copy of it in years.
I presume some of the articles have come to your attention.
They do every so often, yes.
Well, the reason I'm asking, I'm sure you know, is because we had the former chairman of the Green Party, Dan Boyle, on the last podcast, and he mentioned that he thought that the criticism of Sinn Féin was of a particularly low quality, that I don't think we need to go into the kind of the Sunday Independent type of attacks on Sinn Féin, but that the result of that was that Sinn Féin policies aren't being examined very critically. Would you think that's a fair criticism?
I wouldn't, if you mean the criticism of Sinn Féin. Look, the Sunday Independent has a clear political agenda. It's an anti-Sinn Féin, anti-Republican and anti-left paper, and it's been like that for decades, so very few of us take what is written in it very seriously. In terms of scrutiny of Sinn Féin's policies, in fact, I think there is more scrutiny of Sinn Féin's policies than we get from any of the other opposition parties. When we produce our alternative budget every year, when we release policy documents or produce legislation, they are more likely to be carefully scrutinised by the mainstream media than, say, Fianna Fáil's, the Green parties or People Before Profit, for example. Now, I welcome that. We want to have good, serious debate around policies and the alternatives we're offering, so we don't shirk from that kind of scrutiny. But I certainly don't accept Dan's point that Sinn Féin gets an easy ride when it comes to the substance of what we're proposing.
Going back to the economic policies that you were proposing before the 2011 election, if those had been followed, where would Ireland be now?
We would be in a much better position. Crucially, we would have not had the dampening of domestic demand that was a feature of the last 5 years before the economy started to recover at some level. We wouldn't have had the increased levels of poverty or inequality. We wouldn't have had the damage to small and medium-sized enterprises. We wouldn't have had billions handed over to private bondholders.
But we'd be paying a colossal amount of debt, wouldn't we?
Real job creation and real service delivery. So the country would be in a much better state than it is now.
But we'd be paying a colossal amount in interest on debt, wouldn't we?
No, because what a lot of people misunderstand is when Sinn Féin proposed back in 2010 an alternative strategy to the bailout that was being negotiated with the Troika, there was enough money on hand for the state from a variety of sources to outline an alternative course and stimulate our way back to economic growth. The difficulty is within a very short period of time, first Fianna Fáil and then Fine Gael and Labour blew most of the money that was available to the government on massive recapitalisations of banks and bailout of bondholders. So by the time Fine Gael and Labour had their backsides warm around the cabinet table, that alternative approach that we outlined in 2010 unfortunately was no longer available. But if we had taken that course, if we had invested wisely in job creation and improved service delivery, we wouldn't have had the same depths of recession that we had up until this point. And I have to say the issues which are affecting people every day, whether it's mortgage distress, low wages, precarious hours, or crises in our health, education and community services would be much better addressed than they are. So no, I absolutely stand over what we proposed then. Context has now changed, and therefore the proposals we're making now reflect the change in context. But I don't think there's anything for Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael or Labour to be proud of what they've done since 2010.
Okay, so Owen, I understand your point about the pain suffered following the cuts in spending, but given that we have such an open economy, if Ireland had engaged in even more stimulating spending from 2011 onwards, 100% of that cost would have to be borne by the taxpayer, either through debt repayments or through extra taxes, but only a small portion of that stimulation would end up in the Irish economy, because most of what we buy is imported.
Well, none of that is true. But also, crucially, one of the first acts of the Fine Gael and Labour government in 2011 was to pump 17 billion euros from the National Pension Reserve Fund and another number of other sources into the banks. So the crucial point to remember is both in 2010 when Fianna Fáil were in power and in 2011 when Fine Gael and Labour were in power, there were funds available on hand, money that did not have to be borrowed, that didn't come from additional tax revenue, that could have been used to invest in job creation and tackling the structural deficits in health, education and community services, for example.
Okay, so let me develop the point.
On recapitalising banks, which were then meant to lend to small and medium-sized enterprises, give people assistance in dealing with mortgage distress, and get new borrowing into the economy. And of course, they didn't do any of that. So the alternatives we proposed in the first instance were to use those funds. Now, you're right. We have also argued for increases in the tax take, but increases in the tax take in a way that would be good for domestic demand. So very modest increases to the marginal rate of tax, the introduction of a very sensible and credible wealth tax, which would have given additional revenue. And I have to say, the evidence doesn't support the contention that stimulating the domestic economy will result in the loss of that spending to the domestic economy. You know, if you put more money in the pockets of ordinary workers, or if you assist small and medium-sized employers to improving the quality and added value of their product, and therefore the number of people they're being able to employ, that creates a virtuous circle of localized economic growth and development, something we still don't have, notwithstanding the recent GDP figures.
Okay, Owen, hang on a second, Owen. You're correct about the virtuous circle, but in Ireland that's a much more leaky circle, and that money leaks out of the country much more than in other more closed economies. Isn't that true?
Well, it depends, and other countries have managed to handle this much better. Equally small and liberalised economies manage to do this better. Denmark does it, Finland does it, Sweden, Norway, etc. So you can do it, and you can do it in sensible ways. What you definitely don't do is depress domestic demand by increasing taxes on ordinary working families, such as the property tax and the water tax. Making changes to personal tax through abolishing the PRSI ceiling, for example, and reducing the amount of money that people have to spend in the local economy. And what you also don't do is deny small and medium-sized enterprises, the lifeblood of our economy, the assistance that they so desperately needed in terms of tackling upward-only rents, tackling spiraling utility costs, or trying to find a better way of charging rates to businesses which is more reflective of their ability to pay, rather than the very outdated system we have which punishes struggling businesses.
Okay,
all of these things, of course, were things that Fine Gael and Labour promised to do in the 2011 general election campaign, and like so many other of their broken promises, have failed to do since taking office.
And Owen, to move away from the tax side, it is popularly held that there's an awful lot of reform needed in the public sector in Ireland. It is likely that some of that reform would be painful for the people working there, the people who are in essentially poorly managed sectors of the public sector would have to undergo drastic changes in their work practices. Where does Sinn Féin stand on that?
Well, two things. First of all, there's a lot of claptrap that's talked about our public sector. By OECD standards, it's below average in size, and in fact, at the height of the boom, it would have been considered on the smaller side. And the vast majority of people who work in the public sector are averagely paid or poorly paid. So,
but their efficiency.
And what's also important to point out is huge aspects of the public sector are very efficient. And for example, you go into St. James's Hospital, into their cancer care unit, in the public section of the hospital, and you won't get a better quality of care from the doctors and nurses in that hospital anywhere else in Europe. Likewise, for example, when we have bad weather and large parts of the country lose their electricity, and ESB workers, public sector workers, go out and work day and night to restore people's electricity.
But those ESB workers are paid double what the ESB workers, the electricity workers are paid in Northern Ireland. That seems an awful lot of a tax on ordinary people.
I'll come to that, but my point is this. You won't find a better quality service. So the first thing is this. Our public sector isn't too large. In fact, it's too small. There are some public sector workers at the top end getting paid far too much, but there are lots who are getting paid on average or far too little. And there are efficiencies in the system. Now, does that mean there's no need for reform? No, there absolutely is a need for reform. And a lot of that reform is about redirecting resources from the top end of the system and from unnecessary management of the system into improving the quality of service delivery. But also, for example, when people compare, as you've just done, the wages of workers in the Southern Irish economy with elsewhere, they're not taking into account purchasing power parity. So, for example, the cost of living and the cost of things like private health care, of childcare, of education are substantially higher here than they are in the north of Ireland or elsewhere in Europe. So you have to take into account those things as well. And when you take those into account, whether it's our rates of pay or whether it's our rates of social welfare, are much more in line with our European counterparts. Do we need to improve our public services? We absolutely do, but we need to stop maligning public services that work well and provide a top quality service for people, and I named just two of them.
And
we also need to recognise that we have had chronic underinvestment in our public services for decades. We have always been, both at the height of the boom and in the recession before the last boom, and currently well below the European average investment in health and education and community services, etc. Of course, our tax take as a percentage of GDP is also way at the bottom end of the European spectrum. So if we want good quality public services, they have to be paid for, and that requires investment. So I think, yes, we need public sector reform, but a lot of the debate out there is very misinformed, unfortunately.
Owen O'Brien, one final question. Looking at the polls, it's clear that Sinn Féin is one of the three most popular parties in the country between Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and yourselves. Do you think it'll be possible to form a government with only one of those three in the government and two in opposition?
At the moment, it doesn't look like any two-party government will have the numbers. Now, that's only on the basis of the current polls, of course. That may change during the course of the elections. So we'll have to wait and see to the other side of that. What I will say is this. Sinn Féin will not participate in a government led by Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, because that won't deliver the kind of change that we need. Sinn Féin wants to be in government, but we want to be in government to change the direction of social and economic policy, to deliver a fair recovery, and to rebalance our taxation and our expenditure systems to ensure we have fair taxation, sufficient tax revenue, and real investment in the services that people need. And if we can form an alliance with other parties to provide a programme for government on that basis, which Sinn Féin is the lead partner, if the people give us a sufficient mandate at the next general election, then we will be ready and willing to be a player in government.
Owen O'Brien, thank you very much. The Dublin Midwest candidate for Sinn Féin and South Dublin County Councillor, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Make your view heard. Record your own contribution and email it to podcast@here'show.ie. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
And on the line now is Lorraine Courtney, who's a freelance journalist. Lorraine, you wrote an article for The Independent a while back, and you quoted a sex worker saying, "I believe that when two consenting adults have sex behind closed doors, and if money changes hands, then that's none of the state's business." Would it be fair to say that that's your own attitude as well?
It would be my own attitude, William, yeah. I suppose the issue of prostitution does kind of, a lot of people would kind of consider it a moral issue, but is it really like any of our business what other people get up to? And what Laura Lee is a sex worker herself, but she's also a law graduate. So at the moment she's trying, they've reintroduced a new law in Northern Ireland where men will be it would be criminal to actually pay for sex.
So essentially, rather than making the prostitute a criminal, or as well as making the prostitution a criminal.
The prostitute will not be a criminal. No, it's the person,
only the customer,
case, who pays for sex that will be prosecuted.
Okay, this is the Swedish model that has been adopted of reducing demand, I think is what it's called.
That's right. Yeah. Leigh is basically going to fight it, first of all, like domestically in Northern Ireland, but she said, she will take it all the way to Strasbourg, because she feels it kind of infringes on her personal freedoms, and that so it's against the European Constitution on that count, and also that it's against her safety, as sex workers would then be, required to kind of work in dark, shady, out of the way places to solicit for business, away from the public eye, and that it would endanger their lives and their safety.
I think from a libertarian point of view, which is kind of the attitude I would come from, I get that. I can understand how you can make an intellectual argument that two people should be allowed to engage in whatever sort of commerce, and the state isn't really entitled to interfere in that, at least not without a very good reason. But it seems to me that in practical terms, do we have any model of prostitution working in a non-problematic way, in a way that isn't exploitative? Obviously, you can find individual examples of prostitutes, having a lot of personal agency, not being exploited. But do we have any legal system where exploitation of prostitutes is unusual?
Well, it seems to be working pretty well in Holland at the moment. It's all above board there. They're paying their taxes. They have regular STI checks. It's all quite legitimate. It's a legitimate profession.
But the majority of those women would come from Eastern Europe. It's not, the profession that the average Dutch professional mother and father would choose for their daughter.
It might be it might be that, it is something that's done by, let's call them economic migrants, but is that any different to, the economic migrants we have working in the service industry here in Ireland? Prostitution is one thing that, we might be reluctant to do ourselves, but there's a lot of other jobs as well that we're reluctant to do, that we do actually rely on economic migrants to fulfill at the moment.
The one kind of
I suppose, that they're doing, these girls are doing it willingly. They're not being forced into it.
The one thing that kind of strikes me about prostitution, and I think that in the past, prohibition on prostitution was basically bundled up with prohibition on all sorts of other sexual activity, on homosexuality, on even on contraception and so forth. And I can kind of come from a place where you can understand to say that, the state isn't entitled to interfere in that. But my problem with prostitution isn't prostitution, it's everything else about prostitution, that the level of exploitation seems to be very, very high. And I think that might be structural, because when you're working, you yourself as a journalist, or anybody else as a butcher or a baker or a candlestick maker, when they enter the profession, their earning potential isn't so high. And then in pretty much any profession, your earning potential increases as you gain experience, as you gain kind of knowledge. And also, young journalists and many other professions tend to be exploited, and kind of used on the cheap. With prostitution, those two things don't go together. They kind of reverse that. Young women, and it would seem the younger the better, are the younger and more exploitable they are, the higher their earning potential. The longer they're in the game, the lower their earning potential would seem to be. And that early part where, maybe a young teenage girl has the potential to earn a lot of money and very little life experience, seems to me to be very prone to exploitation.
Yes, but isn't that true of a lot of other industries as well, just like the modelling one, or for actors as well?
That's true, but I think those are two very unusual ones.
Any industry that's kind of based on, let's say, lookism.
There aren't that many of those industries, and there does seem to be a very, very strong association between prostitution and pimping.
I'm not sure anybody, becomes a prostitute with it as an idea that this is like a career goal for life. I get the impression myself that, it is mostly like people who are doing it, on a short-term basis.
Would it be fair to say it's mostly survival prostitution?
It could survival, yeah, of course, yeah.
But my point is that when you have very young and sometimes very vulnerable women, and it's not entirely, but mostly women, who are A, very exploitable, and B, at the very height of their quickly declining earning power in prostitution. When you match that very high earning power and the very high vulnerability to being exploited, aren't you attracting very unsavory people into the pimping business?
Yes, but I suppose if it's legal, there's going to be a lot more safeguards around it, and it's going to be like a legitimate industry, and people will have rights and that. If it was to be legalized, I suppose at the moment that we're just looking at this small thing that men can be prostituted or can be prosecuted for if they're caught paying for sex, and isn't this going to endanger those vulnerable girls even more?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. Do I understand it correctly that the law that's being proposed here in the South, whereby prostitutes' clients will be criminalised and liable to prosecution, that will go alongside rather than instead of the possibility of prosecuting the prostitutes themselves?
It would be instead of. I think we're just looking as well at just penalising those who are paying for the sex.
Okay, Lorraine Courtney, thank you very much for joining us on Here's How.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line from Brussels, I have Luke Ming-Flanagan, MEP for Ireland North West. In terms of the CAP, most Irish people live in urban areas. What does the Common Agricultural Policy matter to people who aren't farmers?
Well, that's a very good question, and actually the reason why it's a very good question is because the only way I think we'll ever get fairness on how the Common Agricultural Policy's funds are distributed is if people from outside farming actually take an interest in it. And the reason why I think they should take an interest in it is because if you are a shopkeeper in a rural area, if you are a teacher, or if you are a doctor, you need to be cognizant of the fact that the vast majority of the money that these farmers gets spent in the local economy, and it actually goes around and ends up in your pocket. But the problem that I would have with the way it is currently distributed and the way it has been distributed is that 80% of the money goes to 20% of the richest farmers. This
is something that we've seen reported, that people like Larry Goodman get €500,000 a year, or the Queen of England gets a huge amount of money. Why are those people being subsidised?
Well, I suppose the logic with those who would agree with that is that the only way that these farmers can survive is if they get a top-up from the state.
Well, Larry Goodman needs a top-up from the state?
Well, that seems to be the opinion of the people who redistribute the cap. But I would be of the opinion that Larry Goodman doesn't necessarily need that. In fact, he definitely doesn't need it. And that people who have 150 and 200 hectares of land definitely don't need it. And if they do need that money, well, they should get out of farming, because if they can't make a living off that much land, well, then they're in the wrong game. Now, there was
isn't that true with somebody, no matter what size their farm is?
Well, it isn't, because the problem that exists is that if you have a 20-hectare farm and you are producing potatoes on it, or you're producing milk on it, and you live in the Republic of Ireland, you will expect from that living to actually to live a half-decent lifestyle. And if we had a free-for-all situation whereby they weren't getting any money and they had to compete with people who were operating on wages of maybe 2 and 3 or maybe €4 a day, obviously you would see a situation fairly rapidly where in the globalized world, where you would see produce coming from countries where it is produced for half nothing, and eventually you would see everyone move out of farming in Ireland and no produce would be produced.
Well, hold on a second on
the
that.
basis of whoever can produce it for the least amount of money, and wouldn't take into account the fact that you'd have to bring it halfway across the world in order to achieve that.
Okay, hold on a second on that. That's not necessarily logical because of course, things like manufacturing have moved to China wholesale, and I didn't see any manufacturing workers get their jobs subsidised in Ireland, but manufacturing jobs have moved out. It's not really possible to move the farmland out of Ireland or out of Europe to China, so that doesn't seem likely that all food producing would move out of Europe.
Well, no, all food producing wouldn't necessarily move out of Europe, but if you look at it, the situation at the moment, if someone can produce it for half nothing and they can't produce it for half nothing in Roscommon, for example, well, what do you do in order to keep people producing something locally? Do you say, well, we'll just leave it up to the open market and people will go for the cheaper produce for somewhere else? Or do you help that person produce it locally? And
for example, Luke, the MBNA offices in your constituency in County Leitrim moved out because their cost base changed. What makes farmers into such special snowflakes that they have to be insulated from the realities of the world economy when everybody else has to put up with it?
Because we will survive without credit cards, we won't survive without food. And if we stop producing food in Ireland, inevitably we will end up being left hung out to dry by going off to buy it somewhere else if we don't produce it ourselves. And if you're not producing it yourself, then the people that you're dealing with to buy it off, well, they kind of have you because you don't have it yourself. But if you do produce it yourself, you're not left in that position.
Do you mean that the prices would go up beyond what would be economical for people to buy if we weren't producing it?
Yes, yeah. Well, if we don't produce it ourselves, then we leave it up to someone else to produce it. And basically they have us over a barrel. They can charge us whatever they want if we stop producing it. And actually worse still, if we stop producing it for a generation, we lose all of those skills and we lose all of that knowledge. And then we won't know how to produce anything at all.
Well, I take your point. I take your point on the skills base. But if prices went up, then surely people would get back into farming.
Yeah, they would. Yeah, but in the meantime, where would those skills go? And how would anyone know how to do it? Who would teach them how to do it?
That's a fair point. But I think I want to ask you then: how would you react to the suggestion that the CAP has completely distorted the market over the past 50 years? We have created a whole tier of farmers who are completely unsustainable from an economic point of view, and what we're trying to do is just to keep people in jobs that are uneconomic.
Well, it isn't only about economics, it's about social and environmental as well. Basically, what I believe the Common Agricultural Policy should be doing, it should be used to keep farmers on the land locally in their local community, rather than what it is doing at the moment, which is it is being used to keep rich farmers on the land and put them in a position where they can buy out small farmers, and eventually you will see nothing but massive fields in the country, and you won't see local communities surviving as well.
How much does the CAP cost in total?
Well, to Ireland, in and around 1.6 billion a year, just over $1 billion on Pillar 1, and about 600 million on Pillar 2. And Pillar 2 is more aimed at rural development, as far as I understand.
The problem that a lot of urban listeners would have to spending 1.6 billion a year on Irish farmers who are maybe 2 or 3% of the workforce is that there's an awful lot of deprivation, and much more serious deprivation, for example, amongst long-term unemployed in urban areas.
Yeah, well, the long-term unemployed in urban areas include blocklayers, include plasterers, include painters, include shopkeepers, include people who could work in small and medium enterprise. And if what happens in the midterm review of the CAP, if what I hope happens, if what my ambition is that during the midterm review of the CAP, that more of this money will go back to the small farmer rather than the Larry Goodmans of the world. George Leahy did a study on how the last CAP money was spent, and it was estimated that 50% of the 8 billion was actually spent off farm. and there is a suggestion that much of it was spent on apartments, holiday homes, etc. And if there was a redistribution of this common agricultural policy funds back to the small farmers, they will not be spending it on second houses in Bulgaria, etc. They will be spending it in their local community, and that money will end up with urban people. It was as a result of money from the Common Agricultural Policy that my father would have put in built-in wardrobes for farmers, would have hung gates for them, etc. So as someone who lived in an urban community, they benefited from it. But I feel they will not benefit from it if you have a situation where you have payments of 200,000 and 300,000 euros going to some farmers.
Okay, Luke McFlanagan, one last question. Are you going to come back to the Dáil?
Potentially at some stage. We'll see.
Are you likely to be a candidate in the next election?
No, I won't be a candidate in the next election.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Not at all. Okay, William.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Record a contribution to be included in the next show. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
And that's almost the end of episode 4 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 2nd of April 2015. If you like the podcast, please go to iTunes and give us a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, please follow @Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and of course, subscribe to the show. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. You can do all of that right from www.here'show.ie. Or you could just go out and meet real people and tell them how great the podcast is. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.